Welcome to another deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Today, we're going to be cracking open a proposed piece of legislation that has the potential to really shake things up in the financial landscape as we know it.
Yeah,
The BITCOIN Act of 2024.
it's a big one.
Yeah, it's definitely raising some eyebrows out there.
Definitely.
So just to give everyone a little overview, this was introduced by Senator Cynthia Lummis, and the acronym stands for Boosting Innovation, Technology, and Competitiveness Through Optimized Investment Nationwide.
Wow.
But beyond the catchy name,
Right.
it's really the potential impact that has people talking.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So one of the key things to understand about this bill is that it goes way beyond, just accepting Bitcoin for taxes or something.
Right.
It's about establishing the U.S. government as like a major player in the Bitcoin market.
Yeah, a big one.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
The bill essentially mandates that the U.S. Treasury buy 1 million Bitcoins over a 5-year period,
Wow.
which is a staggering amount, especially when you consider the current supply.
Yeah, that's a significant chunk of the existing Bitcoin in circulation.
Right.
And, that raises a lot of questions about what could happen to the market.
Like what specifically?
Well, for starters, you could see a surge in demand.
Right.
If the U.S. government is suddenly buying up millions of Bitcoins, it's going to create a lot of upward pressure on the price.
So potentially good news for anyone who already owns Bitcoin?
Possibly.
Okay.
But there's also the potential for increased volatility.
Sure.
Anytime you have a major shift in the market like this,
Right.
it can create a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty often leads to price swings.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So,
It would be interesting to see how the market would actually react to a move like this.
it would be a fascinating case study for sure.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the market impact. This bill also has major implications for how the U.S. government would actually manage its Bitcoin holdings.
Right. The bill outlines something called a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which sounds pretty intense.
It is. The idea is to create a decentralized and highly secure storage system for the government's Bitcoin. It's essentially mirroring the way Bitcoin itself works: distributed, transparent, and resistant to tampering.
So instead of having all those Bitcoins locked away in a vault somewhere, they'd be spread across a network of computers.
That's the basic concept.
Okay.
And this raises a whole host of technical challenges and possibilities.
Right.
We're talking about potentially billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So the security protocols would need to be incredibly robust.
That makes sense. And where would these Bitcoins even be stored? Are we talking about government servers or something more independent?
That's a great question, and it's one that the bill doesn't explicitly address.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there are various options: cold wallets, multi-signature wallets, even utilizing blockchain technology for storage.
Right.
The choice of storage solution would have significant implications for security, accessibility, and even the overall philosophy behind the reserve.
I imagine the debate over that would be pretty intense.
Oh, absolutely.
You'd have people arguing for maximum security, others pushing for more accessibility and transparency.
Exactly. And then there's the question of who would be responsible for managing these Bitcoin holdings.
Right.
Would it be a government agency, a private contractor? Would there be some kind of oversight committee?
Yeah.
These are all crucial questions that would need to be answered.
And it all ties back to that bigger question you mentioned earlier. What role should the government play in a decentralized financial system?
Precisely. The Bitcoin Act is pushing the boundaries of that conversation.
Right.
And it's doing so in a way that's forcing policymakers to grapple with some really complex technological and philosophical issues.
It's not just about buying Bitcoin. It's about fundamentally rethinking the relationship between government and digital currency.
Exactly. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this bill:
Okay.
its potential impact on the Federal Reserve.
Okay, now this is where things really start to get interesting.
Yeah.
For those of us who are fascinated by the machinations of the financial system, so tell me more about how the Federal Reserve comes into play here.
Well, the bill actually places limitations on the amount of U.S. dollars the Federal Reserve can hold in surplus.
So it's essentially forcing the Fed to diversify its holdings.
In a way, yes.
Okay.
And here's the kicker.
Yeah.
The bill requires the Federal Reserve to use some of its earnings to buy, you guessed it, Bitcoin.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah,
So the Fed would be directly involved in acquiring Bitcoin alongside the Treasury.
that's right. And that raises some really intriguing questions about the future of the US dollar and the potential emergence of Bitcoin as a kind of parallel reserve currency.
That's a pretty bold idea. Are there any historical precedents for something like this?
Not quite on this scale, but there are certainly examples of governments diversifying their reserves by holding assets other than their own currency.
Okay,
Gold is a classic example.
right, the gold standard.
Yeah, but Bitcoin is a whole different animal.
It is, and that's what makes this bill so fascinating. It's essentially forcing a conversation about the long-term viability of Bitcoin as a store of value and a potential hedge against inflation.
Exactly.
It seems like this could potentially shift the power dynamics within the financial system as well.
Absolutely. The Federal Reserve, traditionally focused on managing the US dollar,
Right.
would now be playing a role in the Bitcoin ecosystem. It's a potential power shift with major implications for monetary policy, financial stability, and even global economic influence.
It's mind-boggling to think about the ripple effects this could have.
It is a lot to unpack, for sure. And we haven't even touched on the bill's 20-year holding period for acquired Bitcoin.
Oh, right.
There's a whole other layer of complexity.
You're right. We need to dive into it's not every day you see a piece of legislation with such a long-term perspective.
It definitely suggests a commitment to a long-term vision, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But whether that vision is about stabilizing the market, managing national debt, or something else entirely is still open to interpretation.
It's like a puzzle box with layers upon layers of intrigue. But before we delve into the 20-year holding period, let's take a step back and address something we haven't touched on yet.
Okay.
The role of individual states.
Ah, yes, the states.
Right.
The bill doesn't mandate their participation,
Right.
but it does give them the option to opt in
Okay.
and store their own Bitcoin holdings within this national reserve.
So a state could decide to go all in on Bitcoin alongside the federal government.
They could.
That seems like a bold move for a state to make.
It would be, but the potential benefits could be significant. Imagine a state using Bitcoin to manage its treasury reserves, potentially hedging against inflation, or even generating returns on its holdings.
It's almost like each state could become its own little sovereign wealth fund,
Yeah,
but with Bitcoin.
that's an interesting way to think about it, and it raises another key question. How would this tiered system of Bitcoin adoption,
Right.
with some states participating and others opting out, affect the overall regulatory landscape?
Right, because we already have a patchwork of state-level regulations when it comes to cryptocurrency.
Exactly. So imagine a scenario where some states are actively embracing Bitcoin and building their own reserves,
Right.
while others are taking a more cautious or even restrictive approach.
Yeah.
It could create a very complex and fragmented regulatory environment.
That's a great point. We could see states competing with each other to attract Bitcoin-related businesses and investments.
Right.
Or we could see states taking vastly different stances on things like consumer protection and taxation.
And then there's the question of how this state-level involvement would interact with the federal government's own Bitcoin strategy.
Right.
Would there be coordination, competition, conflict?
This bill really opens up a Pandora's box of possibilities, doesn't it? But before we get too carried away with hypotheticals, let's get back to the bill itself
Okay.
and that 20-year holding period. What do you make of that provision?
It's one of the most intriguing aspects of the bill, in my opinion, and it really speaks to the long-term thinking behind this legislation. It's not just a matter of acquiring Bitcoin and letting it sit there.
Right.
It suggests a deliberate strategy, perhaps, to instill confidence in the market, signaling that the U.S. government sees Bitcoin as a long-term asset.
So rather than trying to time the market or make quick profits, they're playing the long game.
Exactly. And that long-term perspective could have a stabilizing effect on the market,
Yeah.
especially during times of volatility.
That's an interesting point. It's almost like they're saying, we're not here to speculate, we're here to stay, which could, in theory, encourage others to take a similar approach.
Right. It sends a signal to both institutional and individual investors that the U.S. government is serious about Bitcoin. And that seriousness could lead to increased adoption and investment.
But there's also that caveat about using the Bitcoin to pay off national debt. Does that change things?
It certainly adds another layer of complexity. It suggests that the government sees Bitcoin as more than just a potential investment. It could be viewed as a strategic asset,
Right.
one that could be deployed in times of financial crisis or to address national debt concerns.
That's a pretty bold idea, using Bitcoin to pay off national debt. It almost feels like something out of a science fiction novel.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it also highlights the potential for Bitcoin to disrupt traditional financial systems.
I can't help but think back to that question we discussed earlier. What role should the government play in a decentralized financial system?
Yeah,
This 20-year holding period,
right.
combined with the potential for debt payoff, really muddies the waters.
It does. On the one hand, the government is embracing the principles of decentralization by acquiring and holding Bitcoin. But on the other hand,
Right.
they're also potentially using it to address issues within the existing centralized financial system.
It's like they're trying to bridge two very different worlds.
And that's what makes this bill so fascinating. It's a bold experiment, one that could have far-reaching implications for the future of finance.
It's definitely a lot to wrap your head around, but let's shift gears for a moment and talk about something a little more down to earth.
Okay.
How the average person might be impacted by all of this.
That's a crucial question. And honestly, it's difficult to say for sure,
Right.
but if the Bitcoin Act were to pass, it's likely to have a ripple effect on public perception and adoption of cryptocurrency.
You mean just the fact that the government is buying Bitcoin could make people more likely to consider it?
Exactly. Yeah. It could legitimize Bitcoin in the eyes of many who are still skeptical or uncertain about it.
Especially if they see the government holding it for the long term.
Right. It could signal that Bitcoin is more than just a speculative asset.
Yeah.
It could be seen as a store of value,
Yeah.
a hedge against inflation, even a potential part of a diversified investment portfolio.
Imagine a future where holding Bitcoin is as commonplace as having a 401k.
It's not impossible, but of course there are also potential downsides to consider.
Okay, let's talk about those. What are some of the concerns people have raised about this bill?
One of the biggest concerns is the potential for market manipulation. If the U.S. government becomes such a dominant player in the Bitcoin market, it could have an outsized influence on prices.
So the same actions that could stabilize the market could also potentially distort it?
Exactly. And that distortion could harm individual investors or create unfair advantages for certain players.
That's a valid point. Are there any other concerns?
Another concern is the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining.
Right.
It's an energy-intensive process, and scaling it up to meet the demands of government acquisition could exacerbate those concerns.
That's a crucial consideration, especially given the increasing focus on climate change and sustainability.
Absolutely. And there are also concerns about the potential for government overreach.
Sure.
Some critics argue that the bill gives the government too much control over a decentralized system.
So it's that tension between embracing decentralization and potentially undermining it through government intervention.
Precisely. And there's no easy answer. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
It seems like the Bitcoin Act, if passed, would be a fascinating experiment.
It would be a bold move for sure, and one that would likely have far-reaching consequences that we're only beginning to grasp.
It's like opening a door to a whole new world of possibilities, but also potentially unleashing a Pandora's box of unintended consequences.
It's a reminder that innovation often comes with risks.
Right.
And navigating those risks requires careful consideration and a willingness to adapt.
It sounds like we're at a pivotal moment in the evolution of finance.
We are. The decisions made today about how governments engage with cryptocurrency could shape the financial landscape for generations to come.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important. We need to be having these conversations, exploring these ideas, and grappling with the complexities of this rapidly evolving space.
Absolutely. And it's not just about policymakers and experts. It's about everyone. The future of finance is being written now, and we all have a role to play in shaping it.
So for those of you listening, what do you think about the potential benefits and risks of the Bitcoin Act? How do you see the relationship between governments and cryptocurrency evolving in the future?
These are not easy questions, but they're ones we need to be asking.
This deep dive is just the beginning of a much larger conversation.
And we encourage you to continue exploring, learning, and forming your own opinions.
Because the world of finance is changing right before our eyes. Yeah, it really is both exciting and daunting at the same time.
I agree.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to start wrapping up this deep dive into the Bitcoin Act of 2024.
Hasn't it been fascinating?
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground today. From the bill's core function of requiring the U.S. Treasury to buy 1 million Bitcoins to the potential implications for the Federal Reserve, the creation of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, that intriguing 20-year holding period, and even the potential role of individual states.
We've really gone deep, haven't we?
We have explored the potential market impacts, the technical challenges, the philosophical questions, even the environmental concerns. And we've tried to do it all in a way that's engaging, informative, and thought-provoking for our listeners.
I hope so.
I think so too. And if nothing else, I think this deep dive has really shown that the world of finance is changing at an incredibly fast pace.
It certainly is.
Cryptocurrency, and especially Bitcoin, is no longer a fringe phenomenon.
Right.
It's becoming a mainstream topic of conversation. And I think that's why it's so important to stay informed, understand the issues, and engage in these conversations.
I agree.
Whether the Bitcoin Act ultimately passes or not, it has sparked a debate that I don't think is going away anytime soon.
No, I don't think so either.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
If the U.S. government were to actually become a major holder of Bitcoin, how would that change the global financial landscape?
It's a great question.
Would it accelerate the adoption of cryptocurrency? Would it shift the balance of power in the global economy?
Would it lead to greater financial stability, or would we see even more volatility?
These are questions that we don't have the answers to just yet.
Not yet.
But they're definitely questions that we need to keep asking,
We do.
because the future of finance is literally being written right now.
It is, and it's up to all of us to help shape it.
So that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.